called his gaming hobby childish at family dinner and woke up to an empty joint bank account. I never realized that making fun of him over dinner about his video games was bad until one day it became terrible. But then one day, when I woke up with an empty account and he was nowhere in sight, then I knew that he had the last joke on me. Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm 34 years old, and I thought I was happily married for 7 years to Mike, 36. We were just your average couple, comfortable, settled, and stuck in our routines. I worked a demanding job in marketing, and Mike loved video games. It was his go-to hobby. I always assumed that it was rather immature, but I did not get to comment on that very much, until one family dinner, and that was supposed to be like any other evening. Mike, me, and his family were eating at a round table when we began to burst into laughter. And so, there I was laughing when I decided to voice out something I did not know that would offend him at that time. Something that, as far as I know, shattered us. If someone had told me that a stupid comment would snowball into the biggest regret of my life, I would have laughed it off. But that's exactly what happened. And I'm here to tell you how everything fell apart over a joke I thought was harmless.
I bet.
Mike and I got to know each other when I was 26, and he was 28 years. I was just starting a new marketing career, and he was an IT specialist in a mid-sized organization. We first bumped into each other at a friend's barbecue party. He was just sitting idly on a lawn chair with his phone in hand. He seemed slightly ill at ease, but when I got seated beside him, he looked up and muttered the funniest remark about the meal that must have left me choking on my drink with laughter. Mike had this laid-back, easygoing charm about him. He wasn't the loudest guy in the room or the most ambitious, but he was funny, kind, and never took life too seriously. We started dating, and for the first time, I felt like I could just relax. I had always been the one with plans, checklists, and goals for the next 5 years, but Mike made me feel like it was okay to slow down sometimes. Something that I quickly realized was the fact that Mike was a great fan of video games. He had a little of it in apartment, 2 monitors, headset, and numerous shelves with game discs and different collectibles. Looking back, it was endearing I used to do that. He would practice at night once he got home from work, and I would either watch a show or read a book. It's just his way to relax, I'd snap back every time my friends gave me a hard time for marrying a gamer dude. Mike himself would even make fun of it. He once said he was saving the world one game at a time. For a while, it worked. We laughed a lot, went on weekend trips, and had this easy rhythm between us. Mike was the calm to my storm, and I loved him for that. He wasn't the career guy like the ones I'd dated before, but he was dependable, thoughtful, and supportive of everything I did. It was around 3 years into our marriage when things began to change. That is why, when I was promoted on the job, I was already being provided with more comprehensive care. I was handling larger projects, putting in many hours at the office, and working on the weekends. As for Mike, he could remain the same job and the same playing schedule. I began observing this shift and realized how many hours he spent in the gaming chair. Originally, it was just a couple of hours in the evening after work, and over time it became his evenings, often weekends too. It annoyed me, but I didn't say anything. I thought, at least he's not out drinking or doing something worse. Still, a little voice in my head kept saying, "Is this really it? Is this what our life will look like in 10 years? I didn't realize how much it was bothering me until I started comparing Mike to other people, friends' husbands, who are getting promotions, buying bigger houses, or planning to have children. At the same time, Mike was so happy because he leveled up in some game that I don't even remember the name of, let alone play. Thus, I started seeing him as lazy, unambitious. When we'd sit down for dinner, I'd ask him about work, and his answers were always the same. It's fine. Same as always. But if I brought up his games, his eyes would light up. He'd tell me about missions, scores, and his online friends. I tried to listen, but I just didn't get it. I'd smile, nod, and change the subject to something real, like house plans or finances. But it wasn't the gaming itself, it was what the gaming was for me. To me, Mike was comfortable with never changing this life we had, but for me, I always wanted more for myself, and I wanted that for him too. Each time I found him sitting there with the headset on, I could swear that we were heading in totally different ways. Sometimes I'd hear him talking or shouting to his friends through the headphones as I sat in the living room doing reports. I couldn't help but think, is this really what adulthood is supposed to look like? I started making little comments. I'd call his games silly or say things like, "Don't you want to do something else with your time?" Mike would brush it off or tell me to stop nagging. To him, gaming was harmless. To me, it was childish, and I was slowly losing respect for him. As I look back, I realized that we slowly and gradually stopped being close in ways that we did not even realize we were. I never meant it to be a joke, a play on words like I was only joking, only teasing him slightly. But those small things multiplied, and I didn't pay much attention to how they were affecting him. By the time the family dinner rolled around, all of that frustration and resentment had been building up for years. I didn't see it coming, but that night was the moment everything unraveled. It was a Saturday evening. Mike and I planned to host a dinner for both of our families. These dinners were not very frequent. Mike's family members could not be offended by anything, and they could really turn even a simple party into a noisy one. He was joined by his 2 younger brothers, their spouses, as well as his parents. My parents, and now my younger sister, accompanied me, and it was filled with chatters and giggles until everyone decided to go home. Hosting dinners always made me anxious. Mike's family had always been warm and welcoming, but I often felt out of place among them. They were so easygoing, while I was always wound up trying to make sure everything looked perfect and ran smoothly. Mike never seemed to notice or care. He'd sit back, chat with his brothers, and enjoy himself, while I ran around like a hostess at a restaurant. Initially, dinner was fine. The meal was served, people were having wine, and of course, they were speaking loudly. Mike was seated on one corner of the table, chuckling after his brother said something funny. I was on the opposite end, seated next to my sister. By evening, I could feel this tension gradually seeping out of me in a wonderful manner. At some point, Mike's dad turned to him and asked, "So, Mike, what's new with you? Keeping busy?" It was an innocent question. Mike looked up and smiled. "Yes, I have been working very hard, but I actually signed up for this new gaming tournament with some guys I know online. We had it that we made it to the finals last week." He said it so casually, like it was something to be proud of. And to him, it probably was. The table went quiet for a second before Mike's youngest brother chimed in. "Oh man, really? Which game? That's awesome." The 2 of them fell into discussion about the tournament, and I sensed the beginnings of frustration in me. It was the way Mike discussed work, not with me or with anyone. But games? He could rave for hours about them, as if it was the most crucial thing in the entire world that could happen. I don't know what came over me, but I took a sip of my wine and said, louder than I intended, "Imagine being 36 years old and still spending all your free time on video games. Maybe one day you'll get a real hobby, Mike." The words I said remained perched in the atmosphere for a while. The type of silence that causes sinking feeling in the pit of the stomach pervades the entire environment. Mike's brothers stood still with their mouths open, and all of them turned to look at me. My sister looked at me with big eyes, and Mike's mom looked very uncomfortable. Mike didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his smile gone. I could see the hurt in his face, but he didn't react. Instead, he set his fork down, sat back in his chair, and stared at the table for a moment. Then, as if nothing had happened, he took a sip of his drink and said, "Excuse me for a minute," before quietly getting up and walking into the kitchen. I felt my face heat up. I tried to laugh it off. "I was just joking," I said, pushing out a forced smile. Mike knows I'm kidding. A few people at the table let out small, awkward laughs, and someone quickly changed the subject. But I could feel the tension. I had embarrassed Mike, and I knew it. My sister leaned in and whispered, "Sarah, what the hell was that?" I just forced a no-big-deal look, and to be honest, I was already beginning to regret my impulsive decision to come there. Mike came back a few minutes later and sat down without a word. He didn't make eye contact with me for the rest of the dinner. He stayed quiet, only nodding and offering short responses when someone spoke to him. I kept glancing his way, hoping he'd look at me, smile, and let me know it was fine. But he didn't. His calm, quiet demeanor wasn't like him, and I didn't know what to make of it. As everybody stood up to leave, Mike's mom came over to me, embraced me tightly, and said, "It was lovely meeting you, Sarah. Thank you for hosting us for dinner." It was lovely. She spoke to me politely, but you could recognize she didn't like me. After everyone left, Mike didn't say much. He helped me clean up the table, but there was no conversation. The silence between us was heavy. I tried to break it by saying, "Hey, I didn't mean what I said earlier. I was just joking, okay?" Mike stopped for a second and turned his eyes towards me. He stared with lots of restraint, but his eyes were full of hatred. "All right," he replied, and then headed to the bedroom. I stood there in the kitchen, feeling uneasy. I told myself he'd get over it by morning, that it wasn't a big deal. After all, it was just a joke. Little did I know that the words that came out of my mouth that night would trigger something I could not turn back on. I woke up the next morning to a strange, empty feeling. The first thing I noticed was the cold side of the bed. Mike wasn't there. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he had gone to the couch after we went to bed. He did that sometimes when he couldn't sleep, though it wasn't often. I sat up and yawned before getting off the bed to make some coffee in the kitchen. I still had a bad feeling regarding the dinner last night. I knew I was fortunate to be in his life, even if I ended up causing him so much pain. I said I would do that when he woke, and said about it right enough whenever he awoke next. Maybe I was too hard on him. I said something similar to him the last time I saw him. I will compensate him today. That thought kept me calm for exactly 10 more minutes until I walked past the living room and noticed something strange. There was no gaming console, and Mike was not around either. There was an empty space beneath where it had been sitting, connected to the television by wires, which seemed to have been pulled out roughly. I scowled, pausing there and then. I was initially dumbfounded. Did he move it? Why would he move it? I turned around and looked closer. His laptop wasn't on the side table where he usually kept it either. My heart started to pound in my chest as I scanned the room. It wasn't just the gaming stuff, his headset, a few of his things from the shelves, and even his coat from the front rack were gone. A shiver ran down my spine, but I could not believe what I was witnessing yet. I went to the bedroom and now focused on the search for clues. Then I opened a closet door, and that's when my knees felt weak. Half of Mike's clothes were missing. His drawers were half empty, and his work bag, the one he always kept hanging on the closet door, was gone. "No," I whispered to myself, feeling a smothering sensation in my throat. "No way." I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and called Mike, straight to voicemail. I called again, and again with the same result. The robotic voice telling me to leave a message after the tone felt like a slap in the face. I stood there staring for a moment before I was struck by a rather obvious idea: the joint bank account. I shook my hands when I was opening the banking application on my phone. I entered the password, and what I saw almost made me faint. The balance was 0, completely empty. It was one of those moments that felt like the punch in the gut. Everything is gone. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. I stared at the screen, hoping I was imagining it. I refreshed it. Nothing. I clicked through the transaction history, and there it was. Mike had transferred the entire balance out of the account early that morning. I placed my phone on the bed and then sat feeling dizzy. I sweated profusely, and my heart palpitated so much that I could feel like I would collapse. What is happening? Where is he? Why would he do this? I tried to take deep breaths, but they weren't helping. I called Mike's phone again, only to hear his voicemail for the 4th time. I grabbed my phone and started pacing the room. He wouldn't do this, would he? Was he really this mad about a stupid joke? This doesn't make sense. It's just a hobby. I was just joking. He knows that, right? But I knew he was gone, and deep down, I knew why. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing to piece everything together. I replayed the dinner in my head, the way Mike looked at me when I made that comment, the way he went quiet and distant for the rest of the night. I thought it was just him sulking that he'd get over it like he always did. But this wasn't like the other times. I had embarrassed him in front of everyone, his brothers, his parents, even my own family. I had called him out and belittled something he loved, and I did it with a smug smile on my face. And now he is gone. I checked the house again, looking for any sign that I was overreacting, that maybe he'd just gone out to clear his head. But the more I looked, the more obvious it became. He had taken what he needed, transferred our money, and left. For a moment, I wanted to convince myself that he was just angry and would come back later. Maybe this is just his way of getting back at me. Maybe he just needs space. But something told me that wasn't the case. Mike wasn't the type to make empty threats or pull dramatic stunts. If he did something, he meant it. I felt my chest tighten as panic set in. What am I going to do? How did it get to this point? How could I have been so stupid? I sat there, staring at the empty closet, the bank app still open on my phone. My words from the night before kept replaying in my head, over and over. Imagine being 36 years old and still spending all your free time on video games. Maybe one day you'll get a real hobby, Mike. It had seemed harmless at the moment, just a stupid joke. But now, it was like those words were mocking me. Mike was gone, the money was gone, and I was left sitting in a quiet house, realizing I had no one to blame but myself. The rest of that day felt like a blur. I tried calling Mike a dozen more times, but his phone stayed off. I texted him, apologizing and asking him to call me, but there was no response. By late afternoon, I had reached out to a few mutual friends, hoping one of them might know where he was. Everyone I called said the same thing. I haven't seen him. What's going on? I didn't want to explain. What could I say? Oh, Mike left me and drained our account because I mocked him in front of our families? I couldn't admit that, not to them, and not even to myself yet. Finally, as the evening dragged on, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mike. I'll come back for my things tomorrow. Don't try to contact me. That's when it hit me. He wasn't just mad. He was done. I stared at the message, rereading it until the words blurred on the screen. I wanted to reply, to beg him to talk to me, but I knew it wouldn't help. My chest tightened, and for the first time all day, I sat down and cried. The next day, I didn't sleep in. I couldn't. I spent the whole morning pacing, my stomach in knots. I didn't know what I would say when Mike showed up. Part of me hoped he'd walk in, see me crying, and we'd talk it out. That this was all just an overreaction. At around noon, I heard the front door unlock. My heart jumped, and I froze. Mike walked in, holding a couple of empty duffel bags. He didn't say a word. He looked different, not angry or wild, like I expected, just calm and distant. His face was blank, but his eyes had a coldness I'd never seen before. Mike, I said, my voice breaking. He didn't respond. He just walked past me and into the bedroom. I followed him, watching as he started pulling clothes from the closet and folding them into his bag. My hands shook as I tried to keep my voice steady. Mike, can we talk, please? What is there to talk about, Sarah? He said without looking at me. His tone was flat, almost bored. I swallowed hard. You drained our account. Why would you do that? That made him stop. He turned to look at me, and for a second I thought he might yell, but he didn't. Instead, he spoke calmly, his words sharp as glass. Why? Because I'm done, Sarah. I'm done being treated like a failure. I'm done being your punching bag every time you feel like pointing out what's wrong with my life. You think I don't notice? The eye rolls, the comments, the way you look at me when I mention something that makes me happy? I'm 36, Sarah, not a kid, and I'm sick of being treated like one. His voice never rose, but every word hit me like a punch. I opened my mouth to argue, but he didn't let me speak. Do you know how humiliating it was to sit there in front of my family and our families and listen to you call me childish? Like I'm some loser you're stuck with. He let out a short, bitter laugh. You don't even realize how often you do it. You've spent years picking apart everything I enjoy, acting like you're better than me, like I'm not good enough for you. That's not true, I started, but he cut me off. It is true, Sarah, and I'm tired of it. You care more about what other people think than you care about us, about me. I felt my throat tighten. Mike, I didn't mean it. I was joking. You know I was just joking. His jaw tightened, and he looked at me with disbelief. A joke? Do you think I'm stupid? That's not a joke. That's how you see me, Sarah. I didn't know what to say. I stood there stunned, watching him pack up his things. But to drain the account? Mike, that's everything we saved together. Why would you do that? He turned to face me fully now, his eyes narrowing. You want to talk about betrayal, Sarah? His voice was calm, but I could feel the anger simmering beneath it. Because you're the last person who should be throwing stones. I know, Sarah. I know about your little affair. The words felt like a slap across my face. I froze, my mouth opening, but no sound came out. Mike nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. That's right, I know. I've known for months. My heart pounded in my chest. Mike, Save it, he snapped, his voice sharp for the first time. I don't want to hear excuses. You call me childish, yet you were sneaking around behind my back like some teenager. Hypocrite. I felt tears sting my eyes. It wasn't like that. Don't, he said, cutting me off. Don't try to explain it. I trusted you, Sarah. I loved you. But you turned me into a joke, and then you cheated on me. You've been looking down on me for years, treating me like I'm nothing. So I took everything we built because you don't deserve it. I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. Mike, I'm sorry. Please. I made a mistake. It didn't mean anything, I swear. He stared at me for a moment, his face hard. You know what the worst part is? I did love you. I wanted us to work. But you ruined it. You made me feel small, like I didn't matter. And now you don't matter to me. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Mike, please don't leave like this. We can fix this. He shook his head, zipping up his bag. No, Sarah, there's no fixing this. He walked past me, heading to the door. I followed him, still crying, still trying to stop him. Mike, please don't go. He paused at the door, turning back to look at me one last time. You thought it was funny to make me feel small, to mock me in front of everyone. But now you're the one who's small, Sarah, and you'll have to live with that. With that, he opened the door, stepped outside, and closed it behind him. The sound of the door clicking shut was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. I sank to the floor, sobbing. Mike was gone. The man I thought I'd spend my life with, the man I thought I could push around because he wouldn't fight back, had finally had enough, and I had no one to blame but myself. After Mike walked out, the apartment felt different, like life had been sucked out of it. I sat there on the floor for what felt like hours, staring at the door as if he might change his mind and come back. But he didn't. The next morning, reality hit me like a freight train. The joint bank account, the one we had been building for years, was still empty. It wasn't just a few $100s, it was everything. That account held our savings for a house, vacations, and our emergency fund. Now it was gone, just like Mike. I felt numb as I stared at the banking app on my phone. Part of me still didn't believe it. I refreshed the screen over and over, hoping that somehow the balance would reappear. It didn't. That day was a blur. I didn't go to work. I couldn't face anyone. I stayed on the couch, replaying the confrontation over and over in my mind. Mike's words haunted me. You turned me into a joke. You cheated on me. You don't deserve it. I kept thinking, how did it come to this? But deep down, I already knew the answer. I had underestimated Mike for years, thinking he was too passive to ever stand up for himself. I thought my words didn't matter, that he would just shrug them off like always. I was wrong, and Mike made sure I felt every bit of it. By the second day, the fallout began to spread. I started getting texts and calls from friends, some concerned, others nosy. It didn't take long for me to realize what had happened. Mike had told people. I don't know how many, but he didn't keep quiet. Mutual friends suddenly knew everything. The mocking, the belittling, and worst of all, the affair. My phone buzzed constantly with messages. What's going on, Sarah? Is it true what Mike said? Why would you do that to him? I couldn't even bring myself to respond. I turned my phone off and curled up in bed, wishing I could disappear. The hardest part came when my family found out. I don't know who told them, probably Mike's mom, but within days, my parents were calling me nonstop. My sister finally showed up at my door. When I opened it, she just stood there, arms crossed, looking at me with a mix of pity and disappointment. Sarah, what happened? Mom and Dad are freaking out. I tried to play dumb, but she cut me off. Don't bother lying. Mike's side of the story is already out there. Is it true? Did you cheat on him? Hearing the word cheat out loud felt like a slap. I couldn't answer. I just stood there, frozen. My silence said enough. She sighed, shaking her head. I can't believe you. Mike's a good guy, Sarah. How could you do this to him? She left after that, and I was alone again. In the following days, the shame and guilt became unbearable. Everywhere I turned, it felt like people were judging me, even strangers. Maybe it was just in my head, but it didn't matter. I felt like the lowest person on the planet. I thought about Mike constantly. I pictured him sitting somewhere, smiling and laughing, finally free of me. And he deserved to be. I had mocked him, underestimated him, and betrayed him. Now he was gone, and he made sure I felt every bit of what I'd done. The empty bank account was just the start. It wasn't about the money, it was the message. Mike wanted me to know how serious this was. He wasn't going to let me walk away unscathed, and I didn't blame him. At night, I lay awake replaying every little moment in our marriage, every sarcastic comment, every eye roll, every time I brushed him off when he tried to share something that made him happy. I thought about the dinner where it all unraveled. Imagine being 36 years old and still spending all your free time on video games. I winced every time I heard the words in my head. How could I have been so cruel? But the worst part that ate me alive was the affair. I had tried to convince myself that it was meaningless, a mistake, a moment of weakness, but that didn't matter. It happened, and Mike knew. I didn't even know how he found out, but he did. I thought about the look on his face when he said, "You call me childish, yet you were sneaking around behind my back like a teenager? Hypocrite." He was right. I couldn't argue with him. I had spent so much time looking down on him, criticizing his hobbies, acting like I was better. But in reality, I was the one who had ruined everything. Update: by the end of the week, I felt like a shell of myself. I sat in our empty apartment, surrounded by silence, knowing I had no one to blame but myself. The life I had built with Mike was gone because of me. I kept wishing I could take it all back, that I could go back to that dinner and just keep my mouth shut, that I could go back months earlier and end things with Mike properly instead of betraying him. But life doesn't give you do-overs. I had lost Mike his love, his trust, and his respect, and I had no idea how I was supposed to move forward without him. There's a quote I heard recently that stuck with me. Don't make someone feel like they're hard to love just because you can't see their value. That's what I did to Mike. I made him feel small when he deserved to feel loved. I lost a good man because of my own pride, and I'll have to live with that. I know Mike will move on. He'll find someone who sees him for who he really is, someone who doesn't roll their eyes at his hobbies or make him feel less than. And when that happens, I'll have to remind myself that he deserves it. As for me, I don't know where I'll end up. For now, I'm just trying to pick up the pieces and learn from my mistakes. If there's one thing I can take from all of this, it's that you should never take someone for granted. Because one day, you might wake up and realize they're gone. And when they leave, they'll take more than just their things. They'll take the part of your life you didn't realize you needed until it was too late.